The house stood at the end of Ocean Avenue like a silent sentinel, its towering windows gazing blankly over the small suburban street. It was an architectural gem, Dutch colonial, with steep gambrel roofs, a wide front porch, and a boat dock that stretched out into the canal behind it. For the Lutz family, it was a dream come true. They had been looking for the perfect place to call home for months, and when the realtor showed them 112 Ocean Avenue, they couldn't believe their luck. Spacious, well-maintained, and just within their price range, the house seemed like a bargain too good to pass up. But this house had a past. A dark one. 1 year earlier, the house had been the site of a brutal crime that sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Amityville. Ronald DeFeo Jr. had murdered his entire family as they slept. His parents, his 2 sisters, and his 2 brothers, all shot in their beds. The house had sat vacant since then, and though it had a notorious reputation, George and Kathy Lutz weren't superstitious people. A house was just a house. And this one had everything they needed. They moved in on a crisp November afternoon, the kind of day where the air bites at your skin just enough to remind you that winter is approaching. George stood on the front lawn, his hands on his hips, surveying their new home with a mix of pride and satisfaction. His brown hair was tousled by the wind, and his breath rose in small puffs of steam as he exhaled. "This is it," he said, turning to Kathy with a grin. "What do you think?" Kathy smiled, her auburn hair catching the light as she leaned against the U-Haul truck. She was carrying their youngest daughter, Missy, in her arms while the 2 older boys, Danny and Chris, ran circles around the yard, their laughter echoing through the air. "It's perfect," she said, but there was a slight hesitation in her voice. She couldn't place why, but something about the house seemed off. It was as if the very air around it felt heavier, thicker. She shook the feeling away, telling herself it was just the stress of moving. "I think we'll be really happy here," George added, oblivious to his wife's unease. "Just wait until we get everything settled." That evening, as the last rays of daylight disappeared and the family finally sat down to dinner inside their new home, the sense of excitement had dulled into exhaustion. Moving boxes were piled high in every room, and the children were beginning to yawn, their energy depleted after a long day of running and exploring. The house was much quieter now. Almost too quiet. George and Kathy sat at the table, watching their kids eat in silence. Missy, who had always been quiet and observant, suddenly spoke up. "I saw a pig today." Kathy looked at her, surprised. "A pig? Where did you see a pig, sweetie?" "Outside," Missy said, her small voice solemn. "It was in the window. It had red eyes." George and Kathy exchanged glances, their smiles faltering. Kathy reached out and stroked Missy's hair, brushing it behind her ear. "Honey, there are no pigs around here. You must have imagined it," she said gently. Missy just shook her head, her eyes wide and serious. "It wasn't in the yard. It was in the window, looking at me." Kathy tried to laugh it off, though her heart skipped a beat. "Well, we'll have to keep an eye out for your pig friend, won't we?" she said, but the unease she had felt earlier began creeping back into her mind. As the evening stretched on, George found himself drawn to the fireplace in the living room. The chill in the house was palpable, far colder than it should have been for early November. He stacked logs into the hearth and lit a fire, the orange flames flickering and dancing in the darkening room. Yet even with the fire blazing, the cold lingered. No matter how close he stood to the flames, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping the warmth at bay, like the house itself refused to let him feel comfortable. Kathy came into the room, rubbing her arms. "It's freezing in here. Is the heat working?" "I don't know. The thermostat's fine," George replied, standing up from the fireplace. "I'll take a look at it tomorrow." They both stood there for a moment, staring into the fire as it crackled softly. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, and the old house groaned as if shifting its weight on its foundation. Kathy leaned into George, trying to dispel the growing discomfort in her chest. "Maybe it's just nerves," she whispered. "New house, new everything." "Yeah," George said absently, his eyes still fixed on the flames. "Probably just that." But deep down, neither of them fully believed it. Over the next few days, the unease only deepened. Kathy tried to keep herself busy with unpacking, arranging the furniture, and making the house feel like a home, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when she felt like she wasn't alone. She would hear whispers when she was alone in a room, barely audible but unmistakable. Sometimes she'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The children, too, seemed affected by the house. Danny and Chris, usually rambunctious and full of energy, had become quieter, more reserved. They started avoiding certain parts of the house, especially the upstairs sewing room. One afternoon, Kathy found both boys standing outside the closed door to the room, their faces pale. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "There's something in there," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kathy frowned and opened the door, expecting to see something, anything, that would explain their fear. But the room was empty. Just a few unopened boxes and an old sewing machine left by the previous owners. "There's nothing here, guys. See?" Kathy said, trying to sound reassuring. But the boys just stared at the empty room, wide-eyed and silent. As days turned into weeks, George's behavior began to change. It started small, almost imperceptible at first. He was more irritable, snapping at the children over little things. He seemed obsessed with chopping wood for the fireplace, spending hours outside with the axe, even when they didn't need more firewood. But it wasn't just his temper that was shifting, it was something deeper, something Kathy couldn't quite put her finger on. He had become distant, withdrawn, like part of him was slipping away. One night, Kathy woke to find George sitting upright in bed, staring blankly at the clock on the nightstand. The red digits glowed in the darkness. 3:15 a.m., "George?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "What are you doing?" He didn't respond at first. His eyes were wide, and his face was pale, almost as if he hadn't heard her. Finally, after a long pause, he blinked and looked at her, but there was a hollowness in his gaze that made Kathy's stomach turn. "Nothing," he muttered, lying back down. Kathy watched him for a moment, her heart racing. The clock blinked 3:16 a.m., and as the seconds ticked by, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had woken him. Something more than just a bad dream. The next morning, George was up early, chopping wood again before the sun had even risen. Kathy found him in the backyard, his breath misting in the cool morning air, the rhythmic thud of the axe cutting through the silence. "George, what are you doing?" "It's freezing out here," she said, pulling her robe tighter around her as she stepped onto the porch. "I couldn't sleep," George grunted, bringing the axe down on a log with a heavy crack. "We need more firewood." Kathy frowned. "We've got plenty. Come inside and have breakfast." George paused for a moment, leaning on the axe. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes had that same hollow look from the night before. Without a word, he set the axe down and followed her inside, but Kathy couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was deeply wrong. That afternoon, while Kathy was in the kitchen preparing lunch, Missy came skipping into the room, her blonde curls bouncing as she twirled in circles. "Jody says it's going to snow soon," she said, her voice sing-song. Kathy looked up from the counter, confused. "Who's Jody?" "My friend," Missy said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She climbed up onto one of the kitchen stools, swinging her legs. Kathy wiped her hands on a dish towel and came over to sit next to her daughter. "Is Jody one of the kids at school?" she asked, smiling. "No, silly," Missy giggled. "Jody lives here. She comes to visit me sometimes in my room." Kathy felt a chill creep up her spine. "Oh, what does Jody look like?" Missy's face lit up with excitement. "She's a big pig. She has red eyes, and she can fly. Sometimes she talks to me at night when I'm scared." Kathy's heart skipped a beat. She tried to keep her voice steady. "What does Jody say to you, sweetie?" Missy shrugged, swinging her legs. "She says she likes me. She says we should stay here forever." Kathy swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "That's nice, honey," she said, her voice shaky. "But if Jody ever scares you, you come tell me, okay?" Missy nodded, oblivious to her mother's growing concern. "Okay, Mommy." Kathy watched her daughter run off to play, her stomach churning with a mix of fear and confusion. A pig with red eyes? It had to be Missy's imagination. But the way she had described it, so matter-of-factly, sent a shiver down Kathy's spine. That night, as Kathy lay in bed beside George, who was already snoring softly, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Missy's imaginary friend, about the strange cold spots in the house, and the unsettling behavior of her children. Something was wrong here, she could feel it in her bones, even if she couldn't explain it. She closed her eyes, trying to will herself to sleep, but just as she was drifting off, she heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the hallway outside their bedroom. Kathy? Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She held her breath, listening intently. Kathy? It was louder this time, unmistakable. A voice, low and hoarse, calling her name. She sat up in bed, her pulse racing, and glanced at George, who was still fast asleep. Kathy? The voice came again, this time from right outside the door. Kathy's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she got out of bed and crept to the bedroom door, her heart hammering in her chest. She placed her hand on the doorknob, hesitating for a moment, then slowly turned it, pulling the door open. The hallway was empty, but the air was freezing cold, far colder than it should have been. And that heavy, oppressive feeling that had lingered in the house since they moved in seemed to press down on her, wrapping around her like a dark, suffocating presence. Kathy stood there for a long moment, staring into the empty hallway, her skin prickling with fear. Finally, she closed the door and crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. As she lay there, wide awake in the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. The days in the Amityville house stretched long and cold. No matter what George did, he couldn't warm the place. The fire in the living room fireplace roared day and night, devouring log after log, yet the house seemed to absorb the heat rather than radiate it. Kathy, too, felt the persistent chill, but there was something else, something deeper, gnawing at her. It wasn't just the cold, it was the creeping dread that seemed to follow her from room to room, as though the house was breathing behind her, watching her every move. It started with little things. At first, Kathy thought it was just her imagination, the product of exhaustion from the move and the stress of trying to make the house a home for their family. The constant unpacking, the settling in, and the day-to-day chores should have been enough to occupy her mind, but every so often, she would hear it, soft whispers, barely audible, as if they were carried by the draft that swept through the hallways. Sometimes she would turn to see a shadow move, just at the edge of her vision, but when she looked directly, there was nothing there. By the end of their second week in the house, Kathy couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. The children had changed. Danny and Chris, who usually spent their afternoons wrestling or playing tag in the backyard, had become unusually quiet, spending most of their time huddled together in their shared bedroom. Kathy had caught them whispering to each other more than once, their eyes darting to the doorway whenever she entered. Missy, on the other hand, was spending more and more time alone in her room, talking to her new friend, Jody. One afternoon, Kathy found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, her back to the door, facing the window that looked out over the backyard. The light outside was pale and weak, casting a dull gray over everything. Missy didn't hear her mother approach. "What are you doing, sweetie?" Kathy asked gently, stepping into the room. Missy didn't turn around. "Talking to Jody." Kathy froze, a knot tightening in her stomach. "Oh, is Jody here right now?" Missy nodded, still staring out the window. "She's right there, in the tree." Kathy moved slowly to the window and peered outside. The tree stood bare and gnarled, its branches swaying slightly in the wind. There was nothing there, no movement, no animal, no sign of anything unusual. And yet Missy was so calm, so certain. "She says she likes it here," Missy said, her voice soft but clear. "She says we should never leave." Kathy swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Well, that's nice of her. But remember, Jody's just pretend, okay? She's a friend in your imagination." Missy turned to her mother, her expression serious, her blue eyes wide. "She's not pretend, Mommy. She's real." The hairs on the back of Kathy's neck stood up. She didn't know how to respond. Instead, she leaned down and kissed Missy's forehead, her mind racing. She needed to shake this off, needed to stop letting the little things get to her. But as she left the room, her heart pounded in her chest. She knew something wasn't right. George, meanwhile, was growing increasingly distant. He had always been a hard worker, dedicated to his family, but the move seemed to have taken a toll on him in ways Kathy couldn't understand. He spent more and more time outside, chopping wood even when they didn't need it, or in the basement, tinkering with things that didn't need fixing. When he was inside, he was short-tempered, snapping at the kids over the smallest things, glaring at Kathy when she asked him to help with dinner or clean up after himself. But worse than the irritability was the sense of obsession that had taken hold of him. He had become fixated on the house itself, as if it were a living thing that demanded his attention. He would walk the halls at night, checking doors and windows, pacing from room to room. Sometimes, Kathy would wake in the middle of the night and find him staring blankly at the clock, which always seemed to show the same time. 3:15 a.m. "George, what's going on?" she asked one evening, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're not yourself. The kids are starting to notice." George didn't look up from the table where he was sitting, sharpening a small hunting knife. His movements were slow and deliberate, the scrape of the blade against the sharpening stone grating on Kathy's nerves. "I'm fine," he said, his voice flat. "Just trying to get things in order." Kathy frowned, stepping closer. "In order for what?" George finally looked up at her, his eyes dark and hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. "The house needs work," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Things need to be fixed. I have to stay on top of it." Kathy shook her head, exasperated. "George, we've been here for 2 weeks. The house doesn't need that much work. You're overdoing it." George slammed the knife down on the table, making Kathy flinch. "You don't understand," he snapped, his voice harsh. "I have to keep things under control. If I don't, we'll all." He stopped himself abruptly, his face paling. He looked away, muttering something under his breath. Kathy stared at him, her heart pounding. "We'll all what?" she asked softly. George didn't answer. He stood up and walked out of the room, leaving Kathy standing there, her hands trembling. That night, Kathy lay awake in bed, her mind racing. George had fallen asleep beside her, but his breathing was shallow, and he twitched occasionally, as if he were having a bad dream. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening to him, whatever was happening to their family, was connected to the house. The whispers, the shadows, the strange behavior, it was all adding up to something she didn't want to acknowledge. She thought about the DeFeo murders. About how Ronald DeFeo Jr. had claimed that he had heard voices in the house, telling him to kill his family. The newspapers had painted him as insane, but now, lying in the dark, Kathy couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it. Something the public didn't know. A cold draft swept through the room, making her shiver. She pulled the covers tighter around her, glancing at the clock. It was 3:14 a.m. She held her breath, waiting. 3:15 a.m. Kathy sat up slowly, listening. The house was silent, except for the wind howling outside and the faint creak of the floorboards. For a moment, she thought she could hear footsteps, faint and distant, coming from the hallway. She strained to listen, but the sound faded, leaving only the eerie stillness behind. She lay back down, her heart racing, but sleep wouldn't come. The next day, Kathy decided she needed help. She couldn't go on pretending that everything was normal. She needed answers, someone who could tell her what was happening in the house. She remembered the stories she had heard about the priest who had blessed the house before they moved in, how he had left abruptly and refused to return. George had brushed it off at the time, but now, Kathy wasn't so sure. She picked up the phone and called the local parish, asking to speak with Father Mancuso. The priest was hesitant at first, but when Kathy mentioned the house on Ocean Avenue, his tone changed. I can't come back to the house," Father Mancuso said, his voice strained. "But I'll do what I can to help you from here." Kathy frowned. "What do you mean? What happened when you were here?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "It's not just a house," Father Mancuso said finally. "There's something evil there, something that doesn't want to leave." When I tried to bless the house, I felt it. I heard it. Kathy's skin prickled. Heard what? The voice, Father Mancuso said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It told me to get out. A chill ran down Kathy's spine. What should I do? You need to leave, the priest said urgently. Take your family and get out before it's too late. Kathy hung up the phone, her mind reeling. Leave? That wasn't an option. They had invested everything into this house, and George would never agree to leave so soon. But as the day wore on, and the strange occurrences in the house continued to escalate, she began to wonder if Father Mancuso was right. That evening, as Kathy sat in the living room, trying to calm her nerves, George came storming in, his face flushed with anger. What's going on, George? She asked, standing up. George threw his hands up in frustration. I found a room in the basement, he said, his voice tight. A room that wasn't on the plans. Kathy frowned. What are you talking about? Come see for yourself, George muttered, turning on his heel and heading for the basement stairs. Kathy followed him, her heart pounding. They descended into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. George led her to a small door in the far corner of the room, one she hadn't noticed before. He pulled it open, revealing a small, dark space beyond. The walls were painted a deep, blood red, and the air inside was thick and heavy, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Kathy's breath caught in her throat. What is this? George stepped inside, his eyes wide. I don't know, but I feel like I've seen it before. Kathy stared at him, her skin crawling. George, we need to leave. This house, it's not safe. George shook his head, his face pale. We can't leave, not now, not after everything. Kathy's chest tightened. George, please. The kids. Something's happening to them. To us. We need to go. But George was already backing away, his eyes fixed on the red room as if he were mesmerized by it. Kathy stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, before turning and running back up the stairs, leaving George alone in the dark. That night, Kathy lay awake again, her mind racing. The house felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that she couldn't explain. She could feel it pressing down on her, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. Then, just as the clock struck 3:15 a.m., she heard it again. The whisper, Kathy? She sat up, her breath coming in short gasps. The voice was closer this time, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the hallway. Kathy? She swung her legs out of bed, her hands trembling as she crept toward the door. The air in the room was freezing, and her breath hung in the air in front of her like fog. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. There, standing at the end of the hall, was a figure, a shadowy silhouette that seemed to shimmer in the darkness. Kathy's heart stopped. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her. And then, without a sound, it vanished. Kathy stumbled back into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She crawled into bed beside George, her entire body shaking. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Kathy made up her mind. They had to leave. She didn't care what George said, didn't care about the money they had sunk into the house. Their lives, her children's lives, were at stake. But convincing George was going to be the hardest part. As she lay in bed, waiting for him to wake up, Kathy stared at the ceiling, her mind spinning with fear and uncertainty. Something in the house wanted them gone. And she was starting to think that leaving might be their only chance at survival. The atmosphere inside 112 Ocean Avenue had become suffocating. Each day, the house seemed more alive, more hostile. The air inside felt dense, like walking through a fog of dread. The cold had grown unbearable, despite George's constant efforts to keep the fireplace roaring, and the walls themselves seemed to groan with a malevolent energy. Kathy could hardly recognize her husband anymore. His obsession with the house consumed him, and her children were growing increasingly distant and strange. Kathy had finally reached her breaking point. She knew it wasn't safe to stay in the house any longer. No matter how much they had invested in it, no matter what George thought, they had to leave. But how would she convince him? It was early morning, just after dawn, when Kathy decided to make her final stand. The children were still asleep, and the house was mercifully silent. She found George in the basement, as she had so many times over the past few weeks. He was sitting on a small wooden stool, staring at the red-walled room, lost in thought. His skin was pale, and his hair hung limply around his gaunt face, as though he hadn't slept in days. "George," Kathy said softly, but firmly. "We need to talk." George didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the dark corners of the red room, as if he were seeing something she couldn't. Kathy stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "George, we can't stay here anymore. This house, it's doing something to us. To you. We need to leave." For a moment, George didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned to face her, his eyes hollow and cold. "Leave?" His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. "We can't leave. Not now. It's too late." Kathy felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, it's too late?" George stood up abruptly, his movements jerky and stiff, as though he were struggling to control his own body. "The house," he muttered. "It won't let us leave. I've seen it, in the red room. The things, they've shown me." Kathy took a step back, her heart racing. "George, you're not making any sense. There's nothing in the red room. It's just a small, empty space. It doesn't mean anything." George's face contorted with anger, and he took a step toward her. "You don't understand. The house is alive. It's been here for years, feeding off of us, feeding off of anyone who dares to live here. It wants us to stay, Kathy. It needs us." Kathy's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't her husband. Not anymore. Whatever was happening to George, whatever the house was doing to him, it had taken hold deep inside him, twisting him into someone she didn't recognize. She couldn't reason with him. She had to get her children out, with or without George. "I'm taking the kids," Kathy said, her voice trembling but determined. "We're leaving today." George's eyes darkened, and his hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Kathy thought he might hit her, but then he turned away, staring back into the red room. "Go if you want," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "But you won't make it far." Kathy didn't waste any time. She rushed upstairs, her heart racing as she entered the children's bedrooms. Danny and Chris were still asleep, curled up under their blankets, but their faces were pale, their breathing shallow. It was as though the house had drained them of their energy, leaving them weak and frail. She gently shook them awake. "Boys, get up. We're leaving." Danny rubbed his eyes, groggy and confused. "Mom? What's going on?" "There's no time to explain," Kathy said, her voice urgent. "Just get dressed. We're leaving the house." Chris sat up, his face pale. "Where's Dad?" Kathy hesitated, not wanting to alarm them, but the truth was unavoidable. "Your dad isn't well right now. But we have to go. Please, hurry." Danny and Chris, sensing the seriousness in their mother's tone, didn't argue. They quickly dressed and followed Kathy into the hallway, where Missy was already standing by her door, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. "Jody doesn't want us to leave," Missy whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Kathy knelt down beside her, forcing a calm smile despite the terror bubbling inside her. "Jody isn't real, sweetheart. She's just a story. We're leaving, and everything's going to be okay." Missy shook her head, her voice trembling. "But Jody said bad things will happen if we go." Kathy's stomach churned, but she couldn't afford to let Missy's words slow her down. "We're going, Missy. It'll be okay." Together, Kathy and the children made their way down the stairs, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The house seemed to groan in response, as though it were aware of their plan. Kathy felt a deep sense of dread settle over her as they reached the front door. As she reached for the door handle, it wouldn't budge. She tugged harder, but it was as though the door had been sealed shut from the outside. Panic surged in her chest. She could feel the house tightening its grip on them, refusing to let them go. "Mom, what's wrong?" Danny asked, his voice trembling. "The door," Kathy whispered, her hands shaking as she pulled on the knob. "It won't open." Kathy's mind raced. They were trapped. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for another way out. The windows. They had to try the windows. "Stay here," Kathy said to the kids, her voice cracking. "I'm going to see if I can open the windows." She ran to the living room and tried the large bay window that overlooked the street. The lock was stiff, but with a few hard tugs, it gave way. She pushed on the glass, expecting it to slide open easily. But it didn't move. It felt like the window had been cemented in place. Kathy let out a sob of frustration and fear, pounding her fists against the glass. No, no, no. We need to get out. A strange smell began to permeate the air, thick and sulfurous, like something rotten had taken root inside the walls. The atmosphere grew oppressive, the air thickening until it was hard to breathe. The house felt alive now, more than ever, as if it was responding to their every action, tightening its hold on them. Then, from upstairs, she heard it. Get out. The voice was deep and guttural, not George's, not anything human. It reverberated through the walls, shaking the entire house. Kathy felt a surge of terror wash over her. Whatever was in the house with them, it was angry, and it didn't want them to leave. The children screamed, huddling together in the foyer, their eyes wide with fear. Kathy ran back to them, her heart pounding in her chest. We need to stay calm, she said, though she barely believed the words herself. We'll find a way out. I promise. But as soon as the words left her mouth, the house began to change. The walls seemed to shift, warping and distorting as if the house itself was breathing. The floor beneath them creaked and groaned, and the lights flickered violently, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Kathy grabbed Missy's hand and pulled her close, her mind racing as she tried to think of another way out. The basement. There was a door in the basement that led outside. If they could get down there, they might be able to escape. Come on, Kathy said, her voice trembling as she led the children toward the basement stairs. We're going through the basement. The basement door loomed ahead of them, barely visible in the flickering light. Kathy's hands shook as she grasped the handle, praying that it would open. To her relief, the door swung inward with a creak, revealing the dark staircase below. Stay close to me, Kathy whispered as they descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath their feet. The basement was even colder than the rest of the house. The air was damp and thick, and the red-walled room at the far end seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, as though it were alive with some malevolent energy. Kathy's heart raced as they reached the bottom of the stairs. The door to the backyard is over there, she said, pointing to the far side of the basement. We'll be out of here in just a minute. But as she led the children toward the door, a deep sense of foreboding settled over her. The basement felt wrong, as if it were a different place altogether, a place that didn't belong in the world above. Suddenly, the red-walled room seemed to pulse with life, and a shadowy figure stepped out from the darkness. It was tall and grotesque, its form shifting and flickering in the dim light, as if it were made of the very shadows that clung to the walls. Its eyes burned with a malevolent light, and a low growl emanated from deep within its chest. Kathy froze, her breath catching in her throat. The children huddled behind her, trembling with fear. What is that? Chris whispered, his voice barely audible. Kathy didn't know. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The figure loomed closer, its dark form filling the room, and the air grew thick with a suffocating sense of dread. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The basement was silent again, but the oppressive feeling lingered in the air. Kathy didn't wait for another sign. She grabbed the children's hands and ran toward the basement door, her heart pounding in her chest. She twisted the knob and pushed, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. No, Kathy cried, tugging on the handle with all her strength. We can't be trapped. Tears filled her eyes as she pounded on the door, her voice breaking with desperation. Help us. Someone help us. But there was no answer. No one could hear them. They were alone in the house, at the mercy of whatever dark force was keeping them there. Suddenly, the voice came again, this time from all around them, shaking the very foundations of the house. Get out. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and the floor beneath them trembled. Kathy screamed, pulling the children close to her, as the entire house seemed to come alive, shaking and groaning as though it were about to collapse. And then, as quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The basement was silent again, the air thick with the stench of sulfur. Kathy stood there, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling with fear. "We have to find another way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But deep down, she knew there was no other way. The house wasn't going to let them leave. It was too late. Kathy fell to her knees, pulling the children into her arms as tears streamed down her face. She had failed them. She had brought them into this house, and now it was going to take them. There was no escape. The house had won. But then, a sudden sound broke through the silence, the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Kathy's heart skipped a beat. Someone was coming. "George?" she whispered, her voice filled with hope. The footsteps grew louder, and then, from the shadows of the basement stairs, George emerged, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were hollow, but he was there. He was himself again. "Kathy," George said softly, his voice weak. "We need to go. Now." Kathy didn't hesitate. She grabbed the children and followed George up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. As they reached the top of the stairs, the front door, sealed shut just moments ago, swung open, and the cold morning air rushed in. Without looking back, they ran out of the house, the sound of the front door slamming behind them like a final, angry warning. They didn't stop until they were far down the street, the house looming behind them in the distance, dark and silent once more. Kathy looked at George, her breath coming in short gasps. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. George shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know. But it's over. We're out." And as they stood there, staring back at the house that had nearly consumed them, Kathy couldn't help but feel that it wasn't over. Not yet. They never went back to 112 Ocean Avenue. The house remained, watching, waiting, biding its time. And the evil within it waited for its next victims. Thanks for watching this true-life horror story about the Amityville Horror House. If you like this story and want to see other true-life horror stories, then click like and subscribe below.